They're fantasy in space with laser beams. Hi, welcome to Gunpowder Fiction Plot. I'm Scott, and this is another video in my testing my assumptions about genre fiction series. Today, we're talking about sci-fi. We got 4 books: Binti by Ndidi Okorafor, The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, and A Memory of Empire by Arkady Martine. At only 90 pages long, this is the first in a trilogy of books, and my experience of this is really... I can't say that this is a good book, and I can't say that it's a bad book, because I was working my way into the novel, I was into it, I didn't really have an opinion, it was over. I feel quite ripped off. This was the first chapter, this was not a book. I guess I have to give it 3 stars on a let's put it on a star rating scale, but really, this is a scam. This is only part of a book. If you're going to buy the Binti books, if you're interested in the Binti books, you probably need to make sure that you buy all 3. Like, if I buy a book, I expect it to be a book and not a chapter. We're still in character development here, and it's over. I'm a bit scathing of it. Liked her writing, had potential, was a good treatment, would like the rest of the novel. Potentially a very good novel, but I think that I would have to read the whole trilogy together as one, and I'm reluctant. Nella, however, loves this and has bought books 2 and 3, so I will finish it at some point. A bit annoying. Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is a bit of a booktube darling. It's not a Scott darling, because I really just could not get into it, and I DNF'd it. I don't really know what was going on. I just found it jumped around from perspective to perspective too quickly. I just could not get into it. A bit too fast-paced for my reading tastes. A bit too many characters all at once. That's just something I can't deal with as a reader, so I DNF'd it. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin is a sort of a science fantasy, sci-fantasy sort of book. It's the first in a trilogy. It's incredibly well received. When I asked for recommendations for science fiction and fantasy novels, this one just kept coming up and up and up. Won the Hugo Award and is generally just considered to be a very good book by the majority of people I talk to who have read it. And I'd have to say that I would agree with those praises of this novel. I think that Jemisin is doing something really interesting. I think that this is a book that would transcend genre readers. So if you're not a science fiction or fantasy reader, that this is a book that you should still be looking at. However, I found it a little bit confusing the way it was split up with the narrative, and I don't understand what purpose that had. We have 3 different narratives from 3 different characters in first person, second person, and third person. They're all happening at different times, and it feels a mess. And when it all comes together and you figure out what's actually going on, I don't know why this story couldn't have been linear. I don't understand what Jemisin is doing. I found that confusing. I also found this novel to be really a little bit fast-paced for me to get the most out of it. We've got this cool story about like power and slavery, and Jemisin's writing really brings you in to some of these characters to see the way they're mistreated, to see how families mistreat children, to see the distrust that is sown by this racism within this society. It's very hard to not read this book and instantly think about the American slave novels, maybe something like Roots by Alex Haley. That narrative of why we enslaved people. It's hard to not compare it to that. Of course, this is a fantasy universe, and rather than saying it's not about America, I think it is about America, but I think it is also about slaves in Canada and slaves in Morocco and slaves in Japan and slaves in Greece and, pick your culture. Basically, everybody had slaves at some point, and that's a horrible practice. It's not criticizing it, it's putting you in the shoes of the victims of slavery. I think that's awesome. I want to say it's fantasy. I want to say what's going on is magic, but it's the blurring of the lines between science fiction and fantasy in this novel is a little bit real. And for me, I would have probably put it in the fantasy category. That's why I've picked up a fourth book. I think that this is a really worthwhile novel, and I would really encourage people who have been avoiding this novel because it's labelled as science fiction or fantasy to pick it up and read it. I gave it 4 stars, but in giving it 4 stars, I want to acknowledge that I didn't like the pacing. I didn't like this jumpy around narrative, and that is something that I always complain about in books and other people don't have a problem with. I will continue with this series, and I hope to get used to Jemisin's writing style. I hope that I will be the one that changes rather than Jemisin, because I think it's worthwhile. A Memory of Empire. This had a really fascinating premise, I think. Mahit Dasmar is a new ambassador following the death of the old ambassador. And what happens is that the old ambassador's memory is backed up, and it should be uploaded into Mahit's brain, and there should be like this fusing going on, and it creates this third person. Anyway, this goes all a bit wrong, and Mahit is expected to take over the role as the ambassador, but doesn't have access to all of the memories she is meant to have. I thought that was fascinating, this idea that somebody's consciousness could be uploaded into somebody else, and this merging of people, and I wanted that to be the discussion. Ultimately, Mahit discovers that the ambassador before her was assassinated, and we have a political intrigue novel set in some far-off solar system. And I was all on board for this weird discussion of what this technology meant. What would humanity look like if we uploaded people's brains into other people's brains? Is that possible? How would you think? All of these questions, I would have loved an exploration of that. That's what I wanted to read. Political intrigue, I could read any political intrigue. None, I don't, that's not an original concept. That's like an old hat. And when it turned out to be a political intrigue, I wasn't interested in this novel anymore, and I DNF'd it. But this really pointed something out to me, because it really did remind me of Richard Powers' novel Bewilderment, which was on the Booker Prize shortlist the other year. The idea of technology affecting the way that you think is essentially part of both of these novels. And I never considered Bewilderment to be a science fiction novel, but clearly it is. And when I look back at my reading history, I have a whole host of 5-star science fiction novels. Slaughterhouse-Five is a fantastic example of a great novel that I never counted as science fiction, but is. I've realized through this experiment that what I'm doing is not counting science fiction's positives. Any genre that you read is going to have better books and worse books. You're going to like books better than other books. When I like a science fiction book, I tend to count it as something else. A lot of these books tend to blur boundaries between genres, and that's something that I think makes a book more interesting and often better. Where we're sticking to the rules just makes you a carbon copy of another book. Ultimately, I'm sort of condemning science fiction to mediocrity in my mind by not counting anything that's interesting in science fiction, only counting the carbon copies, the boring stuff. And that's really unfair to the genre. While 2 DNFs, one book that I don't actually consider to be a science fiction novel that I think is actually better belonging in the fantasy series, and One Lie, really would have this as a disappointing read, but it's actually showed me quite a lot about myself as a reader, that I do read science fiction. I just don't ever call it science fiction. It really does, for me, put into question this idea of what is literary fiction, what is genre fiction. They were very separate at the beginning of this experiment, and now they're getting quite goopy and connected, and what's going on, and where do I fit in the goop? What bit of the goop do I like? So in the next few weeks we will have 2 more of these videos coming, I hope. But in the meantime, click here if you want to see me try romance, and here if you'd like to see me try fantasy. Bye.